Yeah, it's great to be here with you all again. Thank you very much for coming out on this chilly evening. A little bit chillier up here than it is down in the Midlands where I'm from. So, as Rob just said, for those of you who perhaps haven't seen me before, my background is really in history and sort of interaction with other cultures, particularly in the Far East. And I'm a translator of Japanese and German. And I give talks about history and modern current affairs. So, a lot to talk about tonight. And so I'll get started. And we'll have a break after about an hour and a quarter. And then we'll carry on after that and have some conversation. So, here's the title then. And these two rather strange pictures refer, as some of you probably know, to the Chinese way of looking at these 2 years, 2011 and 2012. 2011, the year of the rabbit, and it's the year of a particularly aggressive rabbit, as it were, in this case. And next year, 2012, the year of the water dragon, which is a slightly, supposedly in the 5 elements, a slightly more pleasant dragon. I should know because it's the year of my own. It's my own year, so to speak. We've all got one of these years, yeah. And I'm in the Chinese system. I'm a water dragon. So in that sense, 2012 will be my year. So I'm particularly looking forward to that, so to speak. Yeah. Right, but 2011, this particular year that's gone by, has certainly been Armdinga, as we've all seen. We've had rebellion, revolution, civil war across the Arab world. We've had major earthquakes in New Zealand and Japan and Turkey, monster earthquake and tsunami in Japan, the radiation problem in Fukushima, which is still going on. We've had the Obama killed Osama nonsense. We've had the royal wedding and beatification of Pope John Paul II nonsenses. We've had the scandal and closure of News of the World, Murdoch at the Westminster inquiry. That was interesting to see. We've had economic breakdown in Greece. We've had the violent riots in the summer in Britain, self-immolation protests in Tibet with monks and nuns burning themselves to death. We've had rifts between Israel, Egypt, Turkey. We've had the catastrophic Eurozone financial crisis, which is still going on and has yet to reach its climax. And behind all this, we feel that war drums are certainly beating over the Iranian question. But I'd like to congratulate you all on being here and being here on planet Earth, because in a certain sense, according to this gentleman, we shouldn't be. Because according to Carl Johan Caliban, on the 28th of October 2011, then it was all supposed to come to an end, because he was one of those who believed that, as it were, what most people are saying will be happening on the 21st of December next year, 2012. Caliban, a Swedish researcher, Caliban was the one who was saying, no, everything forecast for 2012 is actually going to be happening this year, in 2011. And so he was expecting, according to his very complicated timeline of the acceleration of consciousness, that on the 28th of October 2011, all of the forces of history would, as it were, have accelerated to such a point where time would become meaningless, and we would all be in another almost ascended state due to his understanding of the Mayan calendar. Caliban, I've spoken about him before, so I'm not going to, and these phenomena before, so I'm not going to spend much time on this, but just to remind you that Caliban was associated with these 2 Indian gurus, a man who modestly calls himself Sri Kalki Bhagavan, which is about as elevated a title as you can get in the Indian system. And these two run this amazing oneness temple in southern India. So these are the collaborators of Caliban in his understanding of what 2012 meant. So he's pretty well connected in the Eastern sense, at any rate. And then, of course, so not in addition to Mr. Caliban, who is perhaps the first of the 2012 or 2011 ideologues to be proven wrong, so to speak, This gentleman, who you probably also know, Jose Arguelles, who was possibly the originator in a certain sense of the modern 2012 Mayan calendar phenomenon, with his book, The Mayan Factor, 1987, who really did a great deal to start off the whole phenomenon and really bring it to world attention. Well, he actually died this year on the 23rd of March. So he, unfortunately, is not going to be here to witness what will or will not happen next year. He modestly called himself Valum Votan, which means the closer of the cycle. So Mr. Arguelles will now be watching what's going on this plane from the other side. He did say, however, that he spoke of this present era as the storm of transformation when the entire wave of history crests. So he certainly felt it was an important time in history. But many people would think, would say, that his own particular interpretation of the 2012 phenomenon was somewhat illusory, and I myself would tend to share that view. But certainly he's influenced a very great number of people. So we had the overthrow of the dictators, Mubarak, and of course Gaddafi, and we've also said farewell at last to Berlusconi. Italy, that's rather interesting because of course 1945 we also said goodbye to Mussolini in Italy. And the other relationship between Italy and Libya is that 100 years ago there was war in Libya between Italy and Libya as Italy attempted to colonize and take over Libya. So there's a certain resonance with what's happening 3 times 33 years ago. And the other reason I put up 1945 there is that you have the resonance with 1945, 66 years ago, 1978, 33 years ago. So we've got a certain 33-year cycle which connects 2011 now with 1978 and 1945. It's very interesting to look at the events of those years. But of course, the situation in Japan, as we see, catastrophe in Hiroshima, 1945, catastrophe through water, particularly in 2011. And that has yet to finish because, again, a certain resonance with 1945, there's a radiation issue. So it's not just water, fire and water, it's also something more sinister. And that has yet to be solved because, as I'm sure you know, the Japanese government has not exactly been forthcoming or transparent in what it has communicated to its own people over this issue. So we've got this 33-year cycle then. So as I say, 1911, we've got the Italian-Turkish war for the possession of Libya. And that led on to the First World War in 1914. Because in 1911, when the Italians beat up the Turks in North Africa, the Balkan countries like Serbia and Bulgaria thought, well, Turkey's now weakened, and Turkey was the big guy on their particular bloc. So they took that opportunity to make war on Turkey the following year, 1912, with the first of the Balkan Wars. And those Balkan Wars led on inexorably to the events of 1914. So that's an interesting resonance as well. 1978, just to quickly go through the events of that year, 33 years ago, that was when the Afghan problem started, that we're now dealing with in a certain sense, yeah? When Brzezinski said to President Carter, we can give the Soviets their own Vietnam by funding the Mujahideen to fight the communists in Afghanistan. The Iranian Revolution also starts in that year. In Pakistan, you may remember, Benazir Bhutto's father was then on trial for his life, having been ousted by a pro-American general. He was executed the following year, 79. That meant that both Pakistan and Iran were sort of set up in a certain way to assist with what was going on in Afghanistan. The murder of Pope John Paul I, who reigned for only 33 days. Also in 1978, he was replaced by the Polish Pope, which then enabled the Americans to set up a situation on the other side of the Soviet Union. which eventually would lead to the destabilization and destruction of the Soviet Union further down the road in the 80s. Vietnam ousted Pol Pot in 78. Deng Xiaoping took over in China. That's particularly important because Deng Xiaoping was the direct pupil of number 2 in China, Zhou Enlai. And Zhou Enlai was the guy who David Rockefeller visited in 1973. Come back to that later. So Deng Xiaoping took over in 78, and he was the one then, of course, who opened China to Western capitalism. And so we had the beginning of the bubble, so to speak, with the Western investment in China, and the beginnings of the financial situation which we have today to some considerable extent. The Jonestown Massacre in Guyana, very controversial situation. Remember that? Very strange and mysterious event. Many people these days reckon that it wasn't actually the Mr. Jones who killed the people with poison, but rather it was a CIA organized massacre following a CIA experiment, a real kind of mind control experiment that was taking place there. But I would invite you to look at the material on the web to satisfy yourselves of that one. We were in the middle of the punk era at that time. The punks, of course, were very angry, and as they had good right to be. But often they went into some heavy-duty negativity, and that was also connected with a particular kind of drugs, which were different in a certain sense from the drugs of the 60s. So that was the music that was going on at that time. I remember coming back from Japan in the summer of '79 and going to a pub in London, and that was my first experience of punk music, because in Japan the punk scene wasn't very big at that time. And went into this pub, and I remember the lyrics of this screaming punk band simply being, "We hate, we hate, we hate," repeated over and over and over again. That was it. That was the lyrics. I thought, wow, things have changed since 1974, which is when I left. So that was the mood, so to speak, in a certain sense. I'm not trying to say that was what the punk scene was all about, but that was a very strong element of it, real anger. The world's first test tube baby was born that year, Louisa Brown. And then we have 1912. Next year, looking forward to some resonances again. The Titanic, sinking of the Titanic took place in 1912. It was the year that Britain hit the ice in another way. Captain Scott died in the Antarctic in 1912. So Britain, in a certain sense, hit an iceberg, or hit the ice in more ways than one in 1912. That's a strange metaphor for what would then come, of course, 2 years later. The First Balkan War I mentioned, the Chinese Revolution, where the great Chinese Empire finally collapsed in February of 1912 and was replaced by the Republic. That's something which the present Chinese administration certainly have on their minds. In 1812, going back a bit further, it'll be interesting to see next year how the elite, the transatlantic elite, choose to celebrate the war between America and Britain, which, if you remember, was when the Brits burned down the White House. And basically, in a certain sense, you could say that was a bankers' war, because the bankers in London were not very pleased at the way the Americans were trying to assert their independence vis-a-vis the banks of London and Europe. But that war went on for 3 years. So as I say, it'll be interesting to see what happens next year. Some kind of resonance with that, I'm sure, is going to happen in some way or other. Obviously, I don't mean war. There might be some extra effort to affirm Anglo-American friendship or something like this, but just keep your eye on that one. Napoleon invaded Russia in this year, 1812. So the West attacked the East. That's another key motif, I think, yeah? The West attacked the East and ignored the Middle Europe, Central Europe. Napoleon just marched right across that, just picked up troops on the way from his satellite countries, because they were all under his heel, and then attacked Russia, and we know what happened there. The great comet, the Flogger comet, was seen throughout the year almost. Yeah? Huge comet in that year. So a certain astronomical event was also very prominent that year. Astronomy also reminds me that astrologers at the moment, those of you who are interested in astrology probably know, that we're looking at a certain phenomenon called the Uranus-Pluto Square at the moment. And that's rather interesting because Uranus, which is normally taken to mean what you could call revolutionary drama. Uranus is the revolutionary dramatist of the solar system, and Pluto is a kind of, represents, one could say, in one aspect, annihilation, transformation through annihilation, through radical breakdown, radical transformation, usually pretty strong and violent. So transformation through annihilation, authority, because it's Pluto in Capricorn, and Uranus in Aries, which is usually associated with idealism. So this is going on from this next year to 2015, this gesture. And the last time we had Pluto in Capricorn was, as you can see, 1762 to 78, which includes the American War of Independence, 1776. And the last time we had Uranus square Pluto was 1932-33. And that was, again, a very, very serious time. That was the beginning of course, the Depression. It was when Hitler took over. It was when Stalin was doing his worst in Russia. It was when FDR took over in America and did what he did there. It was a very serious time. It was when the Japanese were getting seriously out of hand in China. It was a very serious time indeed. So that was Pluto square Uranus earlier last century. So this configuration is actually going to be exact in astrological terms, apparently 7 times in the coming 3 years. So again, this is a rather heavy. It's like I would say it's like a certain storm coming towards us. I'm sure astrologers would point out this is not the only way one can see Uranus and Pluto. There are other ways in which it can manifest its forces. But when we look at what has happened in previous times in history, then I think we could sort of resolve ourselves that a certain storm is up ahead. And this is an astrological, I would say an astrological indication of that in a sense, at least until 2015. Now one astrologer I came across on the web, Lara Owens, said the following, because these astrologers are also aware of some of these things, of course. One of the things, she says, as long as free-ish market capitalism is the economic system that dominates the world, there will probably be democracy. The two go hand in hand. Apparent freedom of choice stimulates the economy. The big companies are very keen for the Arab world to become democratized, especially where there is theocracy. Huge markets will open up. Think about the economic ramifications of the liberation of women in the Arab world, for example. So she's actually, I think, really looking at this rather positively, what's going on in the Arab world at the moment. She's not really looking at although she is pointing to the profits that can be made there from Western capitalist forces. On the whole, I think she's looking at this situation rather positively. But of course, there's the other side. For example, Rudolf Steiner, in his lectures, which he gave titled Fall of the Spirits of Darkness in 1917, he pointed out that already in 1910, there was a man who was extremely awake in France. By the name of Francis Deleuze. He wrote under that name, his real name is François. La démocratie et les financiers, Democracy and the Financiers. Deleuze wrote that financiers are usually imagined to be the enemies of democracy, but this is a fundamental error. On the contrary, they run democracy and encourage it, for it provides a screen behind which they can hide their method of exploitation, and they find it their best defense against any objections which the populace may raise. That's 1910. Steiner pointed out this was a guy who was really awake to what was going on, and in his book, Deleuze went on to mention 55 individuals who were running Europe at that time. Francis Deleuze, you can read about him in Wikipedia and elsewhere on the web. So, something you may not be so familiar with is the fact that, of course, for us it's 2011, but for the Muslims it's not. It's not 2011, it's 1432 in their calendar. And so that means, I would say, that the Muslim world, we can expect, is going through a certain kind of crisis.